Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by pscoco.com. That's Phoebe Sod's chocolate website. Phoebe Sod is an independent curator with the Cocoa Exchange, which is a registered trademark of Mars Incorporated. The Cocoa Exchange is formerly known as Dove Chocolate Discoveries. It makes the finest silky smooth chocolate because the products start with the best cocoa beans, which are tested for quality and flavor by Mars expert technicians. The Cocoa Exchange offers not just premium chocolates, but anything from sauces and spices to brownie and cake mixes, and even coffee and martini mixes. So if you wish to treat yourself or someone you love to a sweet and tasty gift, then the Cocoa Exchange is the brand for you. So you go to pscoco.com, that's pscocoa.com. You can click on the Shop Now button. You can put in your order. It'll come delivered overnight. You can start munching away on that chocolate Monday morning. Or you can even go into the cocoa business with Phoebe Sod. You can become a chocolatier yourself. So Phoebe Sod's chocolate website, pscoco.com. Okay, we're really lucky to have this guest today, and I want to thank Doug Campbell for putting us together, Doug Campbell of the Dallas Action. And I believe that Douglas Horne is going to be doing a show with Douglas Campbell as well. The book that just came out, and it's a 2-volume book. It's a ton of information here. Deception, Intrigue, and the War. No, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. And it's a chronology of significant events detailing President FDR successful against Germany during the Second World War. Douglas Horne, are you there?
Yes, Ed. Good evening. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mr. Horne, why don't you tell us about yourself? Who is Douglas Horne?
Okay. Well, I'm first of all, I'm a recently retired former federal employee with 40 years in federal service. 10 years of that was as a junior officer in the Navy. That was a long time ago, in the 70s and 80s. And then the rest has been civil service in different capacities. And I guess probably the highest profile job I had in the civil service was working on the JFK Assassination Records Review Board in the mid-1990s. I was hired by that temporary federal agency to be a member of the military records team, and then I moved up to head the military records team. So that's what I did for 3 years in the 90s, and ended up writing believe it or not, a 5-volume book about the medical cover-up in the JFK assassination. But one of the things I did there that I was most proud of, well, the first thing that we did that I was the most proud of is we interviewed 10 people who participated in JFK's autopsy, and did a pretty thorough job of that, and interviewed many others connected with medical evidence. But one of the other things I did while on the military records team was, it was my team that broke loose the so-called Northwoods documents from the Pentagon, from the records of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the Northwoods documents, for those who may not be familiar, were plans for pretext for war against Cuba in 1962. In other words, false excuses to go to war with Cuba that the world would buy and that hopefully the American people would buy. They were summarily rejected by President Kennedy, but the nature of the pretext, was rather shocking, and that's one of the things I'm proud of, is that I was the person who they handed the documents over to initially, and it was my military records team that got them declassified in record time, and I believe we released those back in 1997, and they've been of great use to historians since then.
Yeah, and basically we were going to create terrorist actions and then blame it on the Cubans so we would have an excuse to attack them.
Right. One of them was an actual terror campaign in cities like Miami and Washington, D.C., to be conducted by anti-Castro Cubans against other anti-Castro Cubans, to include bombing and maiming. Other things like shooting down a drone airliner over Cuba and blaming it on the Cuban Air Force, or sinking a ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming that on Castro. A lot of really, in one sense, harebrained ideas, but also very dangerous ideas. In that not only did the Joint Staff that proposed them, were they gung-ho about it, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff were gung-ho about them. and recommended them to Secretary of Defense McNamara on March 13, 1962. And the concept died about 3 days later in a meeting with President Kennedy when he said, no way in hell. And then about a month later, the Joint Chiefs said, well, let's invade Cuba anyway. We don't need pretexts. And of course, that didn't happen. But it was very exciting to be at the focus of attempts to get Vietnam records, Cuba records, and also to be working on the medical evidence. So after my time with the Review Board, the Review Board was a temporary agency. It only was in existence for 4 years. I went to work for the Holocaust Museum for a while, and then finished up my career with the State Department for 14 years, and then just retired last summer. And basically, after I wrote my 5-volume book about the medical cover-up and published that in 2009, I started to focus on Pearl Harbor, which is a subject that had been of interest to me my whole life. And so for about 5.5 to 6 years, I worked on this book intermittently, generally on the weekends, and it grew into a much bigger project than I initially thought it would. It was really fascinating.
Hey, real quick, well, first of all, we have you to thank for Operation Northwoods documents. Everybody quotes it constantly, and here's the guy we have to thank for it. Thank you very much, by the way. Okay, but curiously, what was that?
I'm glad I could help.
Yeah, well, good. Well, you'll come in handy in the future, too. What about, what did you do for the Holocaust Museum?
I was the manager of the Visitor Services branch. In other words, I was the daddy for the tour guides. Okay. So it wasn't what I would call it's not a scholarly job. It was a labor-intensive human relations job. We had a lot of young people who were GS5s and GS6s and a high turnover rate. So it was and our job was to manage the customer flow every day and hand out tickets, help people through the exhibits, and you can imagine all the things that would come with that in a museum like that, where you don't go there for a Walt Disney feeling. You walk out of there in a very somber and sometimes depressed state of mind, because what you've seen for the last 3 hours was the worst of human nature on display for the sake of remembrance, so people wouldn't forget. So it was a little bit of a challenging job. I only did that for 2.5 years, but I'm proud to have worked for the museum.
Oh yeah, I can see that a little PTSD, a little burnout from doing that.
I think so. Yes.
Now with this book, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War, it's available on Amazon, and we'll have a link up on the Opera Report bookstore. Basically, the theory is: did President Franklin D. Roosevelt have knowledge of the attack, and did he withhold knowledge to the commanders in Hawaii?
To cut to the chase, and then we can explain why I believe this. I have come to believe that, yes, he did gain foreknowledge of the attack 11 days before it occurred on November 26th. And I do believe that he withheld knowledge from the Hawaiian commanders, and the people aiding and abetting him in that strategy supported his policy. And that was General Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, Admiral Stark, the head of the Navy, and 3 or 4 other key people aided and abetted him in that strategy. And the strategy was driven by the fact that even in November of 1941, after all we had done to aid Great Britain, after the Lend-Lease aid and everything else, 80% of the American people did not want to fight Germany. So the American people were willing to provide all aid short of war, but they did not want to get in the war and did not want to fight Hitler. And in fact, that autumn, we can get into this in more detail later also, but in fact, that autumn, FDR had been engaged in an undeclared war against German U-boats in the Atlantic. This is a widely known fact that all historians agree on. And his intent in doing so was to force an incident, a casus belli, an excuse for war with Germany. And in fact, 3 incidents did occur between German U-boats and American destroyers. And the American people, Ed, they just didn't give a damn. And there was no war fever as a result. And nobody was, he gave 2 long speeches trying to get people fired up, and they did not work. And so what he was left with was a backdoor to war, Ed. And this backdoor to war thesis is not a new one. It's been around since the early 1950s, but I think I've connected the dots better, perhaps, than any other revisionist historian in the past. And you see, what happened in August of 1941 was that Roosevelt became aware through our own diplomatic code breaking, through the magic intercepts, that Hitler had made a secret promise to Japan that if Japan got into war with the United States for any reason, that he would make war on America. And Roosevelt essentially had this in his hip pocket all September, October, and November. And although he would have preferred a direct reason to get into the war against Germany, since that didn't come to pass and didn't work, he was left with really nothing but the backdoor war. And about 2.5 weeks after these three incidents had occurred and the American people were not interested in fighting Hitler, this bombshell dropped in his lap, with Churchill, unconvinced, notifying Roosevelt that the British had decrypted a key Japanese naval message saying they were going to attack the U.S. fleet in Hawaiian waters, and he had this plum dropped in his lap. So at that point is when he decided to let the blow fall and to allow him to take a united country into World War II, knowing that Hitler would declare war shortly after, which is exactly what happened. I'm sure your listeners all know that the Japanese attacked on December 7th, 1941. Roosevelt went to Congress the next day on December 8th with his war speech, and he did not ask the Congress to declare war against Hitler, although that had been his sole goal really since May of 1940, was to fight Hitler. He only requested a declaration of war against Japan. That's what he got, and he patiently waited for 3.5 days, and sure enough, Hitler did exactly what he told his ally in private. He did exactly what he said he would do, and he declared war on the United States on December 11th, and then the lineup was complete.
Doug, before we get too far into the story, your audio was a little overmodulated. When I was talking to you on the phone earlier, we had a great connection. Are you still on that same phone?
Yes, let me turn off the speaker.
Yeah, you're on a speakerphone. That's what it is. Okay.
Better?
Let's hear it.
This might be better.
That's 100 times better. Okay, great. Now, a question I have for you is this now. And okay, we knew about the attack coming, okay? But and we could have been more prepared for it. We could have got our ships out of the way. But even if, or we could have met their planes, I guess fighter planes midway or something like that, or shot the planes out of the air. But they were attacking us. So what was the point? They were still attacking anyway. What was the point of not warning our officers over there in Hawaii?
That's a very good question. At some point tonight during this talk, maybe we'll do it now, I want to emphasize the fact that the military leadership in the country, General Marshall, Admiral Stark, and Roosevelt, and the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, they were all really obsessed with the fear that the U.S. military might do something, might take some offensive action, or some action that would be interpreted as offensive action, which would allow the Japanese to say to the world, the United States started the war. Okay. And if that had happened, if the American military had taken some preemptive action to try to ambush them, or to be, let's say, be at sea and somehow meet them at sea and by surprise, and that a dust-up had occurred and fighting had started, he was afraid that if the Japanese could say, no, the Americans started the war, they attacked us, and that if any significant portion of the American people were to believe that, or were to suspect that, he would not be able to take a united country to war. He would be taking a disunited country to war, and that's the last thing he wanted to do. He was obsessed with taking a united country to war, and in fact, on November 25th, this is very important, he said at a cabinet meeting, President Roosevelt, which Secretary of War Stimson recorded in his diary, he said, stand by here. He said it's important that we maneuver the Japanese into firing the first shot without too much damage to ourselves, if that can be done. And then in war warning messages that the United States sent to the Pacific commanders on November 27th and November 28th, this phrase was used over and over in three different messages, that if war was unavoidable, quote, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act, end quote. So what we have is testimony after the war was over by General Marshall and by Secretary of War Stimson before Congress. There was a joint congressional investigation into the Pearl Harbor attack. It was the mother of all investigations. And they made very forceful statements during their sworn testimony that very strongly implied that they had foreknowledge and that it was policy not to warn anybody for exactly that reason, so that we would not be taking a disunited country into the war, so that there would be no doubt in anyone's mind as to who the aggressors were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the reason for that, coupled with the fact that at the time, the Office of Naval Intelligence was tracking what they thought was only 2 Japanese carriers moving across the North Pacific. We can get into that later, too. They thought it was only 2 carriers. Well, it turned out to be 6. No one in the world had ever amassed 6 aircraft carriers before into one blunt offensive instrument, but the Japanese did. So the extent of the damage that occurred was much, much greater than anyone anticipated.
Oh, okay.
Furthermore, the Japanese had developed, the shallow-running torpedoes that could operate in the very shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. No one knew that they could do that. And they had also taken battleship shells and put fins on them and turned them into bombs, which could penetrate the armored decks of American battleships. So until this attack occurred, the people in Washington, for the most part, 99.9% of them thought that the battleships were immune to serious damage. They thought the Japanese could not use torpedoes in Pearl Harbor because the water there is only 40 feet deep. And at that time, most torpedoes would plunge to at least 75 feet before coming up and leveling off. So they thought, well, the Japanese couldn't use torpedoes. And the armored decks of battleships at that time were believed to be impervious to any bombs used by naval aircraft. Now, as it turned out, as I said, the Japanese developed 50 special bombs for use only at Pearl Harbor, made from battleship armor-piercing shells. So these bombs were much bigger and much heavier than normal bombs, and that's how the Arizona blew up. So I think that they thought the damage would be much less. They thought it would be more of a hit-and-run raid with minor to moderate damage at best. And they didn't expect it to be the catastrophe that it was. They correctly, I think, anticipated that it would unite the country, and it certainly did, and isolationism died overnight. And in fact, on December 8th, when the Congress voted, the Senate voted unanimously for war, and there was only one dissenting vote in the House. So that strong national isolationist fervor, which was about 1/3 to 40% of the electorate were isolationists. And Congress was becoming increasingly uncooperative with Roosevelt in doing things that he wanted to do because they were suspicious that he was trying to drag us into the war. So what he feared was a 3-month debate in Congress. That's what he told Churchill. If I try to declare war, we'll have a 3-month debate in Congress. He didn't want a 3-month debate, and he didn't want to take a disunited country into the war, so that's why he was in favor of not notifying people so that they wouldn't take any offensive action that would confuse people as to who started the war.
Fascinating. Because I was going to ask you that. Could we afford to lose those ships? But now, well,
as it turned out, yes. But at the time, people didn't think that way. As it turned out, yes, we could. They were obsolescent. Battleships are obsolescent. They were obsolete, except that the U.S. Navy didn't recognize it yet. Pearl Harbor slapped us in the face and made us realize that the old battleships were obsolete. And we were very lucky that day that 2 operational aircraft carriers operating out of Pearl Harbor were not in port. So the whole scheme of projecting naval power changed overnight after that attack. But up until the attack, the thought was that battle line was essential to conducting an offensive in the Pacific, and as it turned out, it wasn't essential. What became essential was the aircraft carrier.
This might be a little bit off topic, but how come Japan was never able to attack Hawaii again for the rest of the war?
I think to make a long story short, I think the proper patrols were probably conducted thereafter. Up until the Pearl Harbor attack, There was a limited number of patrol planes available, and Admiral Kimmel was hoarding most of them, waiting to use them in an offensive against Japan once the war started. Everybody felt war was imminent within 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, but he was hoarding most of his patrol planes for the offensive and was using only limited numbers to patrol around Oahu. So, and he didn't have sufficient numbers anyway to conduct a full-scale surveillance 360 degrees around the island for more than about 2 weeks without all the planes breaking down. These are piston-driven airplanes, which require a lot of maintenance and a lot of repair parts. So he didn't have enough planes to do a full-scale patrol, and he was saving what he had, most of them, for an expected offensive, which never happened.
Yeah, 'cause it would seem to confirm your theory. If they were never able to do another attack there, we probably let it happen. You know?
Yeah.
So now, what evidence do you have that you come up with that we know for sure that we were aware of the impending attack?
Okay, so this is the part of the argument that's a little bit nuanced, and I solicit the patience of your audience. Between August of 1941 and November 26th, the United States and Japan were at loggerheads, and we had cut off Japan's oil, imposed an oil embargo and a full trade embargo. And they felt pushed into a corner, and we felt war was imminent. They felt it was imminent. But both nations were working for a temporary accommodation to delay the inevitable war. So both nations were working toward what we would call, what the diplomats call a modus vivendi, which is a way of living together for at least 3 months to delay war. And not only were the Japanese working on this, so was the United States, with Roosevelt's consent and with Secretary of State Hall's consent and with the cabinet's consent. But then on the 26th, Roosevelt flipped overnight and told Secretary Hall not to issue the modus vivendi, the draft had been completed. It had been approved by the cabinet. It was about to be sent, and instead to send what amounted to an ultimatum. So I'm going to read to you the message, which I believe the British decrypted. Now, this is a JN-25 Japanese Navy message. This is not one of the diplomatic messages that we were breaking in Washington with our so-called purple machine. This is one of the JN-25, Japanese Navy 25 code messages. We were attempting to break that code, had it solved possibly to a readable extent, but the people in Washington were reading messages a month old, so I don't think they broke the message. The British code breakers in the Far East, who were working for Bletchley Park in London, they had started breaking the JN-25 code a year before we had and were much farther ahead of us, based on the few reports that the British have released over the years. So I'm going to read to you the text of this message that was sent on November 22nd, 1941, and which I believe was decrypted and which I believe Churchill forwarded to Roosevelt late on the 25th. So here's the text. Now, this is from Admiral Yamamoto. He's the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the head of the Japanese fleet. It's to all those aircraft carriers. It's sent to the First Air Fleet, which was the 6 large Japanese carriers and all their escort ships. Here's what he says. The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities, shall attack the main force of the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal it a mortal blow. That's pretty specific. Then the last line of the message reads, should the negotiations with the United States prove successful, the task force shall hold itself in readiness forthwith to return and reassemble. End quote. Let me interpret that for the audience. If the negotiations are successful, you will not attack Hawaii. Instead, you'll turn around and come home. That's what that means. And that message with that text is the only thing that I have found in the record that explains Roosevelt's behavior on the 26th of doing a complete flip-flop. And instead of trying to reach a temporary accommodation with Japan, which would buy at least 3 months of peace, sent them an ultimatum they couldn't accept, which said, by the way, the ultimatum, called the Hull Note, Secretary of State Hull, so it's called the Hull Note. The Hull Note said Japan must remove all of its troops from China and Indochina. So Japan had been at war in China for 4 years and was unable to escape. They had occupied much of the coast, many of the cities, but they couldn't extricate themselves from that war. And they were not about to lose face like that and leave China, which they considered it their right to exploit and dominate China. They had taken over what we now call Vietnam and Cambodia. They had taken over the northern French Indochina in 1940 and southern French Indochina in July 1941. And in fact, we're preparing to use that as a jump-off point to take the rest of Southeast Asia. And they knew that, and we knew that, and everybody knew that. And so the ultimatum said, you must remove all your troops from French Indochina, from China, and you must only recognize the Chiang Kai-shek government, the Nationalist Chinese, which was the Japanese enemy. And by the way, you must participate in a treaty that will guarantee the integrity of French Indochina. So all of these things were unacceptable. We knew it when we sent it, and therefore I believe that it was Roosevelt's intention to make sure that negotiations didn't prove successful by sending the ultimatum, and which he knew would mean that the Japanese fleet would not turn around and go home. It would proceed to its target. So, I mean, you and I, anyone listening, you can only imagine the anger and the outrage of a president that would have received a decryption of this message that the enemy was coming to attack Hawaii, what we considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific at the time. And how dare they? So this was his response, I believe. Now, there were clues in the record that something did come in on the 26th. We don't have a smoking gun, but we have many clues. One clue is that the Congress asked General Marshall after the war, why did you send out your big war warning on the 27th of November, warning the people in the Pacific that you want Japan to commit the first overt act and that the Japanese might attack, the Philippines or Malaya or Dutch East Indies? Why did you send that message? And one might expect that Marshall would have said, well, because we sent them an ultimatum the day before, but that's not the answer he gave. The answer he gave was, I believe something came in on the 26th, which is really interesting to me. Really? Something came in on the 26th? That's the day, by the way, that Roosevelt flipped his foreign policy and decided to send the ultimatum. So there's another clue in the record about where this came from. Admiral Kimmel, the Navy's second official goat for the Pearl Harbor attack, he was the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, who was blamed with dereliction of duty after the attack. He was allowed to question Admiral Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, in 1944 at the Navy Court of Inquiry. There were many Pearl Harbor investigations during the war. One of them was the Navy Court of Inquiry. So he asked Admiral Stark, and at the time, this was a top-secret transcript, he asked him at the time, he said, did you receive on November 26th proof that Japan was going to war with Britain and the United States? And Admiral Stark's answer was as follows. I'm going to exercise my right not to reveal state secrets, and I refuse to answer the question, quote unquote. And the Navy Court of Inquiry upheld his right to refuse to reveal state secrets. Well, that's really interesting in light of what George Marshall said a year and a half later. Not only that, George Marshall was asked during some other testimony before the Joint Committee, he was asked, were we receiving information from a foreign power that was very sensitive? And he says, yes, we were receiving information from Great Britain that was extremely sensitive. It was so sensitive, they wouldn't give us the exact text of what they had, but they would give us summaries until the middle of the war, and then they started sharing the exact text with us. So basically what he's talking about is decrypted messages. He didn't use the word decrypted messages, but he made it very clear that's what it was. And they said, well, we don't have any of this in the record. And he said, well, we've been very careful to keep this out of the record so you wouldn't know anything about it. So we have Marshall admitting we're getting secret information from the British, which is basically decrypted messages, which they didn't share the exact text with us until the middle of the war because they didn't trust us. We've got Marshall saying in other testimony after the war that I sent my war warning on the November 27th because something came in on the 26th. But I don't remember what it was, he said. And then we got Admiral Stark saying, well, I'm not going to answer that question. Did I receive warnings of war on the 26th? I'm not going to reveal state secrets. And he was allowed to hide behind the skirts of national security at the time. So the last piece of this puzzle I like to present is that on that day, the day Roosevelt flipped his foreign policy on its head, later that afternoon, he sent his son, Colonel James Roosevelt, who was in the Marine Corps, one of his sons, up to New York City. And Colonel Roosevelt delivered a message from Roosevelt to Churchill to a very secret circuit. And the secret circuit was an underwater cable that went across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean from New York City to London. And the circuit was connected to the British purchasing office in New York City, called the British BSC is the shorthand. It's an acronym, but the British purchasing office was run by a Canadian named William Stevenson. He was the famous man called Intrepid, who ran the office, and the code name of the office was called Intrepid. His job was to purchase all the war supplies for Great Britain in this country, and his other job was to get America into the war. In some ways, that was his principal job, was to manipulate American public opinion and American politics and get us into the war to pull, Great Britain's bacon out of the fire. And so this circuit was used occasionally between the two leaders when they didn't want any records kept of what they were saying to each other. An official message of no great import, or one that was not controversial, would have gone through the State Department, and there would have been a record of it. But this circuit was used that day, and the message that his son sent up there to send back to Churchill said as follows, quote, "Negotiations are off. Services expect action within 2 weeks," end quote. So that was the message that day, and we know that because an internal office history was written by that office in 1943, and then the contents of that internal history were put into a book in 1962. So a couple of other historians, and not just me, believe that that message from Roosevelt's son, from Roosevelt to Churchill via his son, via New York City, sounds like a reply. It sounds like a reply to an earlier message. So the presumption here by me and by others is that that's probably the same circuit Churchill used on the 25th to send the gist or the essentials of this decrypted message to Roosevelt, probably sent it on the 25th. Somebody probably hand-carried it to Washington. Roosevelt probably read it the morning of the 26th because he was ready to send the temporary peace agreement the day before. He was ready to send the modus vivendi and forestall war for at least 3 months to give us more time to reinforce the Far East. And he flipped overnight. And this message that I read earlier, the Japanese message from Yamamoto to the First Air Fleet, I think I'm the first person that's identified, exactly which message it was that caused Roosevelt to send his ultimatum. There have been a lot of explanations offered by mainstream historians, and none of them have really held water. None of them have made any sense. This is the only thing that makes sense to me, because the last line in that message is, if negotiations are successful, turn around and come home and don't attack Hawaii. Well, this was his last chance to get into World War II with the united people behind him. The 3 destroyers who were shot at by German U-boats, that didn't do the trick. Even though one of the destroyers was hit by a torpedo and killed a lot of people, and it barely made it back to port in Iceland, and the 3rd destroyer that was fired at was sunk with great loss of life. So this backdoor to war was all they had left, really, as far as taking a united country into war. So this message has been out there hiding in plain sight since 1946. It was published in the Congressional report published by the Congress on the Pearl Harbor investigation, but it was buried in they had like a 1-volume final report and 39 volumes of supporting evidence. And no single human that I know of has read the whole thing. It's just like virtually impossible. And there was another publication also published in 1946, Campaigns of the Pacific War, published by the U.S. Army, which was the result of their interrogations of Japanese naval officers immediately after the war. So both of these sources know that this message was sent. They know it had to be sent over the airways by radio because it went to all the ships of the First Air Fleet at a time when all those ships were gathered in a northern port, the port of Hitokapu Bay, which is north of Japan in the Kyōrai Islands. And they weren't in port. They couldn't receive any telegraph messages. They had to receive it by radio. And at that time, the Japanese were sending all of these messages in JN-25. So let me put it to you this way. The U.S. Navy compiled a report that they would show to Congress in 1946 if they were forced to. The report was about their breaking of the JN-25 code, how many Japanese messages we had intercepted before Pearl Harbor, and what those messages said. The Congress was distracted by other code-breaking stories. They were distracted by the magic diplomatic messages we were breaking. They were distracted by the so-called east wind rain message, the winds code, and never got into JN-25. And in fact, the Navy had threatened people with imprisonment and with loss of retirement benefits if anyone voluntarily spoke about JN-25 code breaking to the Congress. So nobody did. So they had this report ready to show the Congress if they had to. They never did, and it wasn't declassified until 1991, 50 years after the Pearl Harbor attack. And the upshot of the report is that between September of 1941 and the attack on Pearl Harbor 3 months later, on December 7th, over just a 3-month period, the U.S. Navy intercept stations in the Pacific, which were all over the place, intercepted over 26,000 Japanese Navy messages. That's a lot of messages. And what the Navy did while the Pearl Harbor investigation was going on, as soon as the war was over, they looked at these 26,000 messages and they said, well, it looks like maybe 2,000 of these might be important. And then they decrypted those 2,000 messages. They say only after the war. I don't believe that, but that's what they said in the report. Of the 2,000 messages they decrypted after the war in late 1945, they decided that 188 of them were directly relevant to Pearl Harbor, and if all of them were declassified and all of them were laid on the table and all of the dots were connected, that those 188 messages would together in the aggregate have revealed the Pearl Harbor attack. And they said, but we never declassified these until 1945 and 1946. We didn't have time. If you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you in the Gobi Desert. But that was the official position of this report. And guess what 2 or 3 key messages are not among the 188 messages? The one I read to your audience about go attack the U.S. fleet in Hawaiian waters is not among those supposedly intercepted. Neither is a sailing order sent to the First Air Fleet 3 days later on November 25th, which says this task force, keeping its movement strictly secret, shall leave Hitokapu Bay on the morning of 26 November and advance to, and it gives a position halfway across the North Pacific, advance to 24 degrees north, 170 degrees east, and refuel on the afternoon of 3 December. So that was the sailing order that told this massive fleet to get underway. And it was either that sailing order or the attack Hawaii message that I'm sure the British decrypted and sent to Roosevelt. I do not find it credible, Ed, that these 2 key messages that we know were sent, because all the Japanese naval officers after the war said, oh, these were sent, these had to be sent or the fleet wouldn't sail. We know these were sent. We wrote them. And one guy said, I wrote these. The other guy said, I received these. I was with the First Air Fleet. So we know they were sent. And they had to be sent or the fleet would not have moved. It would not have sailed. For those not to be among the 188 messages that the Navy said they did intercept related to Pearl Harbor is not worthy of belief. I was in the Navy 10 years, Ed, and I can tell you one thing. The Navy is very big on lessons learned. And when anything goes wrong, the first thing they want to do is do a big study, find out what went wrong so it won't be repeated. So I'm pretty sure that shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Navy dug up all of these intercepts that it had and said, let's decode the ones from November and see what we missed. And they probably said, oh my God. Okay, and somebody probably said, we're going to get rid of the 3 or 4 smoking guns that would be a smoking gun standalone and just say we didn't intercept it. We're going to seal up the rest of these, and we're not going to officially decode them till the war is over. And I think that's what happened. So if you're asking, is there a smoking gun that proves that this message was decrypted? No, but the diplomatic actions of President Roosevelt and the context that I've just described, I think, make it pretty clear that this message, or a summary of this message, or the sailing order sent 3 days later, was sent by Churchill to Roosevelt, and which literally landed in his lap and gave him his backdoor to war.
Let me ask you this, though. You said that there's some alternative theories of why Roosevelt made this sudden reversal in his approach. What are those alternative theories? Just for devil's advocate.
One of them was in the memoirs of Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, and he said that the message he sent, the 10-point note, the Hull note sent on November 26th, was his own idea, which is just not worthy of belief because, first of all, when President Roosevelt embargoed Japan's oil, decided not to sell them any more oil in July of 1941, he was against that because he knew it would cause the Japanese to go to war. He knew it would cause them to attack the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. We were providing over 90% of Japan's oil. He knew that if we cut off their oil, it would eventually cause them to go to war with us, and he was against that. Roosevelt embargoed the oil. Anyway, the Navy was against it. Roosevelt embargoed the oil anyway. So then, in November, Cordell Hull was very much in favor of the modus vivendi, the temporary agreement to prevent and forestall war for at least 3 months. The Japanese proposed one to us on November 20th. Roosevelt jotted down with a pencil his own ideas. Cordell Hull massaged the Japanese offer and had a counter offer ready to go. So it doesn't make sense that he decided on his own authority to suddenly tear that up, the thing he favored, tear it up, and then send an ultimatum. In fact, one of his subordinates witnessed him, called to the White House the morning of the 26th of November by telephone. He came back 15 minutes later, very angry, red in the face, and said, those men in the White House don't understand what they're doing. You cannot present an ultimatum to a proud people and expect them not to attack you. This means war. That's what he said to Landreth Harrison, one of the people on his staff who recorded it for history in his diary. So that's one explanation that doesn't make sense, that Cordell Hull said, well, I did this on my own. The other explanation was that Chiang Kai-shek's ambassador, the Chinese ambassador in Washington, didn't like the modus vivendi temporary agreement. Of course he didn't like it, because it didn't discuss China at all. The temporary agreement ignored the issue of China because the Japanese knew we wanted them out of China. We knew they weren't going to get out. And so we talked around it, and we said basically, if you'll pull out of South Vietnam, we'll give you a little bit of oil. That was the basic agreement in the modus vivendi. But it didn't talk about China at all. So Chiang Kai-shek's ambassador didn't like it, but so what? He was a minor player in this drama. The major players were Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, and the Japanese government. So, and then the third explanation that doesn't make sense is that Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, had a diary entry that said, I called the president the morning of the 26th and said, did you read the memo I sent you yesterday? And Roosevelt said, well, no, I haven't seen it. And he says, I told him what the memo said, which was that 30, 40, or 50 Japanese troop ships were moving south towards Southeast Asia. And he said Roosevelt fairly jumped out of his chair, jumped out of his skin, and became very angry and says, this proves they're negotiating in bad faith. So that explanation doesn't hold water because, first of all, that's not what the Stimson memo said. It actually said there were 10 or 20 Japanese ships, and they were moving down the Yangtze River. It didn't say there were 30 or 40 or 50 moving at sea towards Southeast Asia. And there is evidence that Roosevelt did see that report the night before anyway. So Roosevelt, I think, was engaging in histrionics to cover himself, and most likely Stimson was engaging in supporting actions in his diary, I would think. he was very loyal to the president, and he was, of all the men around the president, he was the one most in favor of going to war against Hitler. So, and he was also a Japanophobe. So, those are the other three explanations, and none of them really hold water because Secretary of State Hall had no real authority when it came to anything hot. He was frequently ignored by Roosevelt, often pushed aside, and the big decisions were made by the president. And like a lot of other presidents after him, FDR had both of his hands on the steering wheel of foreign policy. So those are the three traditional explanations, but for me, they don't hold water.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be as plausible as your the 26th intercept there.
Right, the head of Navy code breaking, Captain Lawrence Safford, he had been in charge of trying to break this Japanese Navy JN-25 code for 2.5 years. He admitted years later, he wrote two letters. He wrote one in 1963 and I think another one in 1970, and he said that JN-25 was broken to a readable extent by the Pearl Harbor attack. We were just reading traffic a month old, because what was happening was the poor U.S. Navy, they had the people in Hawaii, the best code breakers they had, working on the wrong code. They had them working on the flag officer's code, which they thought was the important one. Turned out it wasn't, and we never did break that code. And so all of these 26,000 intercepts that were intercepted by U.S. Navy radio stations all over the Pacific, they'd be sent back to Washington by Pan Am Clipper, sometimes by ship, and then across country by train or airmail. They would arrive in Washington, 3 or 4 weeks late, and then they were a month late trying to break these messages, but they were a year behind the British at least in their practical ability to break the code, and they were looking at traffic a month old due to lack of resources. So I think this claim in 1946 with this top secret ultra report, which wasn't declassified till 1991, this claim that yes, we intercepted a lot of messages about Pearl Harbor, but we didn't decode any of them until after the war was over. It's just not worthy of belief, Ed. That's not how the Navy operates. And in fact, everyone in Washington who was anywhere near Navy communications and the code breakers and the main Navy building knew there was a massive cover-up immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack. So it's my informed speculation that this cover-up probably included the 2 or 3 smoking gun messages, particularly these two, the November 22nd Go Attack Hawaii message and the November 25th sailing order. It probably got rid of those intercepts and then kept all the other ones that weren't standalone smoking guns and said, we'll just decode those after the war. Say we didn't have time. And it was just too embarrassing for them, I think, to admit that they bet the farm on the wrong horse, on the wrong code.
If the official story was that they had these 2,600 intercepts and they didn't bother to decode them, and then we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, wouldn't somebody be punished for that? Isn't that a huge gaffe, for someone in charge of these intercepts? Did
it certainly looks bad in retrospect, but let me see if I can try to answer that by setting the stage for all this. At the time, in the whole United States Army in Washington, there were only about 25 or 26 code breakers.
Okay.
Total. The total U.S. Navy only had about 36 people. Some of them were civilians and some of them were in uniform. And then there were a few more people who were linguists who could translate Japan to English, but there were very few code breakers, and most of these people, sadly, were dedicated to the wrong in hindsight, to the wrong activity. And by that I mean the magic intercept. So what happened in September of 1940 is the U.S. Army, a bunch of mathematical geniuses, using their own analysis and using the Navy Shipyard Laboratory, built a machine called the Purple Machine, which would magically decrypt all of Japan's high-level diplomatic messages sent from the foreign ministry in Tokyo to its embassies around the world. And it was so impressive that Secretary Stimson said, it's like magic. And so that's the name of magic was henceforth applied to the broken diplomatic traffic. But this required the dedication of about two-thirds of these cryptanalysts, we call them, the code breakers. About two-thirds of them were dedicated to doing the magic every day.
Gotcha.
Either feeding the intercepts into the machine to get it broken or into translating it into English. So there weren't that many people left in Washington to work on it, and the people in Hawaii were all told to work on the Flag Officers Code, not JN-25. And the people in the Philippines were told they could work on JN-25, and they were in fact supposedly cooperating with the British. But I get the impression from my reading that the British were only sharing with them on a limited basis, and all of the claims from the surviving people from the Philippines, the American codebreakers after the war, they either refused to talk about it, period, or the few that did said, well, we weren't able to read entire messages yet. We couldn't read very much before Pearl Harbor. So, but I know for sure the British were way ahead of us. And so, by the way, this is 26,000 messages that we intercepted from the Japanese Navy to its ships and commands between over just a 3-month period. And for us to collect all of these, including 188 that were directly related to Pearl Harbor, such as go pick up the special torpedoes, take them to this place, go conduct practice torpedo runs on moored battleships, go and do this, go and do that. The fact that we could intercept 26,000 and 188 that were related to Pearl Harbor and somehow miss these two key smoking gun messages, I just don't believe it. The ability to intercept these messages was very good. We had people in Hawaii doing it. We had just the interception, just radiomen copying down the Japanese Morse code. In 2 places in Alaska, 1 place in Guam, 1 station in Hawaii, 1 in Washington, others in California, and 1 in the Philippines. This is a lot of radiomen copying down messages. And the Japanese wouldn't just, send them once a day. They were sending messages 3 times a day. So these radiomen, if they missed a serial number, and they said, oh, we got serials 5, 6, and 7, and we missed 9 and 10, they would get the message the second or third time it was transmitted that day. These people were very, very good. So these messages were literally, of all types, were literally, one of the places intercepting them was a listening post in Hawaii. And they were being driven over the mountain every day in a pickup truck to Commander Rochford's office in Pearl Harbor. He was looking at the to's and the froms, radio traffic analysis. Who's sending messages to whom? But he couldn't break them. He didn't know how to break JN-25 yet. And then he was mailing them to Washington. So there's a lot of irony here and tragedy, if you want to look at it that way. But so we didn't really get our act together on JN-25 until after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And guess what happened then? 3 days after Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 10th, Captain Safford in Washington directed Commander Joe Rochford in Hawaii at Station Hypo. He's the head codebreaker in Hawaii. He says, okay, stop working on the Flag Officers Code. You can work on JN-25 now. That's your major assignment. And then a code book arrived 5 days later that should have been delivered in July and was mysteriously delayed twice. I kid you not. And the code book was the Japanese JN-25 basic code book. The part of it we had broken in Washington, which was supposed to have been delivered in July, and then after an initial delay was supposed to have been delivered on November 1st. Didn't get there till December 15th. 3 days later...
Oh, we got a commercial break coming up.
Okay.
We are with Douglas Horne. This is fascinating stuff. The 2-volume books, Deception, Intrigue, and The Road to War, Volume 1, Volume 2. You can get it on Amazon.com or you can get it at the Opperman Report bookstore. And now a word from our sponsors. Did you know that 30% of all people on online dating websites for personal ads are either married or in a monogamous relationship? if you suspect that your husband, your wife, or your girlfriend may be cheating on you, go to emailrevealer.com. At our online infidelity investigation. You give us their email address, and we can trace it back to online personal ads, dating sites, and social networks. We can even expand the investigation and find them cheating on escort service sites or even porn sites if they're registered for porn sites. So check out emailrevealer.com. Check out cheating. Check out our online infidelity investigation. Children of the Beast. Alistair Crowley's Shadow of Humanity. And this second chapter of the book raised a chapter on just about everybody in the world. Jack Parsons, everybody's in it. It's incredible. And I definitely recommend this book because there's a bunch of pictures in there too of all these people and different chapters of information. Ants on the way. People I've never heard of too. Nobody. Jesse Boyd. I don't know who he is. But it's great stuff by our producer here, William Ramsey. So check out Children of the Beast. Alistair Crowley's Shadow Over Humanity. You can find it on Amazon.com, or you could find it in the Opperman Report.com bookstore. We have an urgent bulletin. It seems that the group Strawman is still on the loose. It has been confirmed that Strawman are Canadian, okay? And that authorities are asking people to stay indoors, lock your doors and windows until this group can be dealt with. You could find more information about this group of Canadians, at strawmanmusic.com. You can have your air code here. We're looking for sponsors. Okay, but we desperately need sponsors right now to take this show to the next level. So you can have your your ad played at Red Live, like I'm doing now, say archery. Or we can even a little jingle for you with some music and stuff like that. You have no idea how inexpensive it would be to have your ad played on the Opperman Report. 7 stations live Friday night, 7 stations on Saturday. Plus, replayed every day of the week on different stations. And then archived on YouTube, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and all different kinds of podcasts, Pod This and Podbean, all different kinds of places who archive the show for us. And on those archives, your ad would play indefinitely, forever. You also get a little banner on OppermanReport.com. You get a mention on the air, you get a little interview on the air, and all sorts of stuff. We have an opportunity to get this show on a major AM/FM station in California. We've been approved. So if you want to sponsor us into that, so incredibly inexpensive that your ad would be heard by the range covers 5 million people population where your ad would be broadcast, and all these other stations would be thrown in for free. So really affordable.
You'd like to important information nobody else does, and creating a fantastic commercial free.
Get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. You can get a copy of that book at emailrevealer.com, or you can get a copy of that book now. It's back up on Amazon.com. How to Become a Successful Private Investigator by Ed Opperman. And this book has been updated a little bit from the previous book that we had. That was available to our wonderful.
It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. And don't forget, this show is brought to you by pscocoa.com, pscocoa.com, Phoebe Sod's chocolate site. You can go there and pick up some chocolate, have it delivered to you in the mail. You'll be eating that fine gourmet chocolate tomorrow afternoon. Now, we're here today, fascinating stuff. We're with Douglas Horne, and it's a 2-volume book, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War, Volumes 1 and Volumes 2. Now, Doug, I got a question for you, because right before the break, we were talking about these code books were delayed.
Roosevelt in Hawaii and his code breakers, right?
Yeah, right. They were delayed. But the thing is, now, do you think that's part of the was just a coincidence or a snafu, or was that part of this plot?
Unresolved mystery, Ed. I'll finish that story in a moment, but there are two great unresolved mysteries, and one of them is, why was his code breakers begged and pleaded to be able to work on JN-25 for 6 months, and they were told no.
Really?
The Philippines will handle that. And then the other unresolved mystery is the number one target for the Japanese Navy's aircraft were the American aircraft carriers, and they were not important. They were sent on errands by the Navy in Washington on November 26th. They were ordered to take fighter planes to Wake and Midway Islands. So they weren't there during the attack. So the record is very unclear on both. We don't know why his code book was delayed twice for so many months. It really stinks 10 miles off if you want to know the truth. And there's no explanation for that that's even been given by the government. In terms of the carriers, one of them, the Enterprise, was due back in the harbor the morning of the attack and was delayed by bad weather. And she didn't come in until the evening of the 7th. So on the carriers, I think we just got lucky because one of the ships was supposed to be in port that morning and was just delayed. And the message from Washington that ordered them to deliver fighter planes did not specifically say leave on this day and don't come back until this day. It didn't say. It just said move fighter planes to Wake and Midway. Now, that message was sent on November 26th. That date keeps coming up over and over and over again. It's really interesting. But so those are the two unresolved mysteries, I think. But if I could get back to and give the audience the end of that story and tell them why it's important.
Yes, please.
Commander Roosevelt was finally allowed to work on JN-25 Japanese Navy messages on December 10th. He got his missing code book or delayed code book on the 15th. On December 16th, the Japanese admiral that attacked Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo, Vice Admiral Nagumo, was in charge of those 6 aircraft carriers. He sent a damage report back to Tokyo, telling the damage he thought his airmen had inflicted in Pearl Harbor. How many ships did we damage? How many did we destroy? 3 days later, Commander Rochefort and his codebreakers at Station Hypo had broken that message. And they had just started working on JN-25. 3 days later, they had broken the message enough to tell Admiral Kimmel on December 19th, this is the message the Japanese admiral who attacked us just sent back home. So to me, that's a remarkable feat for somebody who had not been allowed to work on the code. And all I'm saying is that this makes it a virtual certainty to me that the British did break the message. That's the point of that story, is that I think it would have been routine business for them. And in fact, what I haven't told your audience yet is there are numerous anecdotal accounts by code breakers who worked for the British in Singapore that they did in fact warn Churchill of the impending Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor, and that they did ask him to inform the Americans. The information on those people is in my book. They're all deceased now, of course. But the two of them were the number 1 and number 2 code breakers at the Far East Combined Bureau in Singapore. And they specifically remember sending specific warnings that an attack was going to Pearl Harbor, and that they notified Churchill in plenty of time. And The importance of this message coming in on November 22nd, the one I read at the beginning of the broadcast, it would take sometimes several hours to possibly a day or two to decode a Japanese Navy 25 message, a JN-25 message. If it was a very short one, like the sailing order, they might break that in a few hours. But if it was a longer message, it might take a half a day, a full day, a day and a half. And so the date that was sent, November 22nd, gave the British plenty of time to break that and send it back to London, and for London to turn it around and do something with it. And in fact, one of the British anecdotal sources was Mr. Cavendish Bendick, one of these people with a hyphenated last name, who was on the Joint Intelligence Committee, and he remembered discussing the fact on December 5th that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and he says, have our American brethren been notified? And everybody said, yes. So there are numerous anecdotal accounts that the British certainly believed they provided plenty of warning to London, and there's even one from London that Washington had been notified. So,
well, do we have actual testimony from these code breakers? Did they testify to this or something? Do we have statements?
Well, of course, the American position is that none of our code breakers broke these messages until after the war. That's the official American position, that we intercepted them, but all they were pieces of paper with numbers on them, and they weren't broken or decrypted until 1945 and 46. That's the official American position. None of those people testified. Congress missed the boat on that.
I'm talking about the British ones, though. The British ones.
British people were not invited to testify before the Joint Committee because the Joint Committee was focused on the wrong codes. They were focused on the magic diplomatic code and the importance of that, and they were focused on something called the winds code, which was just a weather warning, an innocuous weather warning that the Japanese sent out over their shortwave radio broadcast saying war with America is coming or war with Britain is coming. They used weather codes like east wind rain, west wind clear, and whether or not that was sent and received. So they were, I don't know if they were intentionally deflected or if it was just an intentional sin of omission where the U.S. Navy decided not to tell them about JN-25. And the JN-25 code breaking, of course, is how we sprung the ambush at Midway, at Coral Sea and Midway. And of course, the ambush at Coral Sea was a draw. We fought the Japanese to a draw, but we damaged two of their carriers so severely that they couldn't participate in the Midway battle. And then, of course, we kicked their butts at Midway a month later, and that was all because of JN-25. And all of the great successes of American submarines in the Pacific were due to JN-25, where we would know where Japanese convoys were going, and we would know when they were going, and the submarines were able, over the course of the war, to intercept them and sink most of their merchant ships. So no, none of these people testified, and unfortunately it was old men telling stories to historians, telling stories to their neighbors, and before they died, which is not the best way to do it, but that's all we have.
And none of them could write a book about this. You think that if they had this kind of information, they would write a book about it or something, or a TV interview? Do we have anything like that?
One of them did, and that was Eric Nave. Eric Nave was an Australian naval officer who started working for the British Navy in the 1920s. He was probably their best Japanese linguist and their foremost breaker of the Japanese Navy's codes. And in fact, he was the first person in the Far East to break the JN-25 code, and he did that in September 1939. And then the people in Bletchley Park started helping him with it, and they flew an expert out with their massive code book, the things they had broken, in December 39, and then the two of them worked on it from then on in Singapore, and they became the experts. So Eric Nave wrote a book along with Mr. James Rusbridger called Betrayal at Pearl Harbor in 1991. And it was the best description we had up until that time of what JN-25 was, how it was decrypted. Basically, they said it wasn't hard, it was just extremely tedious, very time-consuming, and required a lot of labor. And the only problem with Nave is that he stopped working at the Singapore code-breaking unit because of ill health and went back to Australia early in 1940. So he was the best codebreaker they had with JN-25, but because he couldn't handle the tropical heat, he went back to Australia in early 1940, and he stated in the book that he was confident, personally confident, that station at Singapore could decode JN-25 throughout 1940 and 1941. He thought they wouldn't have had any problem. But he couldn't prove it because he wasn't there anymore. So he's the only one that had written a book. Everyone else was scared to death of the British Official Secrets Act. And in fact, in response to that book, which made a lot of allegations, the British finally released JN-25 decryptions in 1997. And you can go to the British National Archives now and look up intercepted Japanese Navy messages that were decrypted, and you'll get the decrypted translations, but guess when they start? They don't start until the spring of 1942. So, I smell a rat.
Yeah, the cover-up goes on until today. Why does the cover-up continue till today?
Well, because I don't think the British government will ever admit on their own, without the green light from... I don't think they would ever admit that, yes, we warned Roosevelt about Pearl Harbor, because it would destroy the special relationship they had with U.S. intelligence. It would basically give this country a black eye and cause a furor over here that would make 9/11 take a back seat. Without our go-ahead or our consent, I don't think they would ever do that. But the fact is, they were breaking these messages in large quantities from December 1939 on, and for them to finally say, well, this is all there is, and they only started in March 42, and yet all these people that used to work out there before they died said, oh no, we had the whole story in November, and we warned Churchill, and we asked him to pass it to the Americans. That's all I need to hear. I mean, I believe it. In fact, the files in the British National Archives say Japanese naval messages from 1941 through 1945. But then when you look in the collection, they don't begin until March 1942.
Amazing.
I did this, I engaged in a runaround between the British National Archives and the British GCHQ. Now, GCHQ has been in the news the last week. That's the British version of NSA. That's their codebreakers. And I went back and forth between them, back and forth. It was like a ping pong game, with both of them pointing at each other. The archives, who I ended up leaving, saying, no, we're not withholding anything. We don't hold any Japanese Navy messages that are classified. Everything we hold is unclassified, and no, we're not keeping a lid on anything. And they're telling me that if the numbers don't add up, the serial numbers for that day, for November 25th, if they don't add up, then that means that GCHQ is either still holding it or destroyed it. GCHQ is telling me that no, we turned over all of our messages of that nature to the archives back in 1993 or whatever it was, 1993 or 4. They said, we're not holding anything anymore, and yet there are discrepancies in the numbers that indicate that 5 or 6 messages from that day that Churchill would have seen can't be found. So I tend to believe the story I got from the archives, which is that either GCHQ is still holding them, or they chose not to retain them, which is a nice way of saying they destroyed them. So that's an interesting mystery that isn't resolved and probably won't be, but at least I tried to pursue it, and it was a god-awful thing to try to write about, but I did my best. It's an interesting mystery story about another government giving a researcher the runaround and pointing fingers at each other, 2 agencies pointing fingers at each other. It was really, once I took a few steps back from it, it was very amusing. So you know what to do next, Ed, if it's okay?
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about this key conference that Roosevelt held with Churchill at sea.
Okay.
Off the coast of Canada in August of 1941.
Yes.
And that's called the Argentia Conference. And let me explain what that tongue twister means. Churchill and Roosevelt had been exchanging correspondence since September of 1939. Roosevelt started writing Churchill as soon as Churchill was put into the War Cabinet by Neville Chamberlain. So Britain and France go to war with Germany September 3rd, 1939, because Germany has just invaded Poland and World War II is beginning. And FDR knows that the only man who's been wanting to stand up to Hitler in the British government has just been put into the War Cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. So they began exchanging correspondence, and Chamberlain said he didn't care, go ahead. So it was rather unusual that a president would be writing a cabinet member, but that's what was going on. So they'd been writing messages back and forth ever since then. And then Churchill became prime minister on May 10th, 1940, and immediately began asking for aid, material aid of all kinds. And Roosevelt did all he could to provide material aid, including trading 50 old U.S. destroyers for 8 British bases, for leases on 8 British bases in the Western Hemisphere. That's the destroyers for bases deal. That was consummated in September 1940. And then the Lend-Lease program was basically dreamed up by Roosevelt in December. He talked about it at a press conference on December 17th. He made a major fireside chat, probably the most important fireside chat he ever made, December 29th, and said, we need to give Britain everything they need for free because they're bankrupt. They can't pay for any more weapons. And they're defending Western civilization, and we can't let them go down or we will be living at the point of a gun. So, and then he proposed it to Congress, and finally, in March 1941, the Lend-Lease program was authorized. So Britain was now getting everything for free. But there were problems. American merchant ships were still not allowed to carry war materials for other countries. We were restricted by the Neutrality Act, and Roosevelt had not been able to repeal that yet. And so a lot of British merchant ships were being sunk, and the British Navy did not have enough destroyers to protect all these convoys, so a lot of ships were getting sunk. And so we were providing aid to them, but it wasn't all getting there. So these two guys finally decided we need to meet each other in person and take each other's measure and see if we can establish some personal aspect to the relationship and maybe, wink, wink, make a few secret deals. So in August 41, the U.S. is not in the war yet. Churchill comes over in secret on the battleship Prince of Wales in the cold weather and the fog of the North Atlantic, a big secret. Roosevelt sneaks away from Cape Cod, where he's supposed to be having a vacation, and he goes up in couple of U.S. cruisers in destroyer escorts, and they meet each other off Newfoundland at Argentia. Now, that's one of the 8 bases that we got from them in exchange for those 50 destroyers. So they meet at Placentia Bay at a town called Argentia, which is also a base off of Newfoundland. They meet for 4 days, and publicly, all they did was issue the Atlantic Charter. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The Atlantic Charter was a propaganda document about moralistic post-war aims, which was produced to justify the conference in a non-threatening way to FDR's isolationist opponents. So it basically said, we're going to support self-determination for all peoples, free trade, blah, 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 after Nazi Germany is defeated. So as far as the public knew, these guys had met to just discuss loosely how to defeat Nazi Germany and to declare solidarity with each other. And it implied that there would be a United Nations, in so many words, after the war. So it was moralistic post-war aims, but really it was a smokescreen. Now, here are the secret agreements that Roosevelt made behind closed doors, which the American people knew nothing about at this conference. Number one, he promised to Churchill that U.S. Navy warships would commence convoying British merchant ships from Canada all the way to Iceland on September the 1st. This was a big deal. As soon as Lend-Lease passed back in March of 41, all of the interventionists on his cabinet, like Henry Stimson and Frank Knox and others, Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury, and Harold Ickes, others, they wanted Roosevelt immediately to escort British merchant ships with U.S. warships. Roosevelt kept delaying and delaying and delaying because he knew the public really would not be in favor of that. They would have sensed that, this is dangerous. This could get us into the war. Hitler might take offense at that. It might declare war on us. So he waited until when he thought the time would be right. So he promised in secret to start doing this on September 1st, and in fact he followed through on September 16th. In the only reason there was a delay is this massive convoy in Halifax wasn't ready yet. It wasn't ready to sail. So that's the first promise he made. The second one, the big one, was to wage undeclared war against the German Navy in the Atlantic in the hope that there would be an incident that would serve as a casus belli justifying America's entry into the Second World War. Now, I'm going to quote from the minutes. Churchill went back and reported on this meeting to the cabinet, and the British cabinet keeps minutes, official minutes. So these were declassified after the war, and one of the quotes is, Churchill told Roosevelt at this conference, quote, "I would rather have an American declaration of war now and no supplies for 6 months than double the supplies and no declaration," end quote. FDR told Churchill in response that if he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Nazi Germany, quote, "it would debate the issue for 3 months," end quote. That's what he didn't want, because what would come along with that is, even if you won the debate, you'd have a disunited country. So Roosevelt told Churchill that he, quote, "would wage war but not declare it, and that he would become more and more provocative, and that if the Germans didn't like it, they could attack American forces," end quote. That's a hell of a quote. He would wage war but not declare it. He would become more and more provocative, and if the Germans didn't like it, they could attack American forces, end quote. So, and Roosevelt also said, quote, "he would look for an incident which would justify him in opening hostilities," end quote, in the next few months. So those were the basic secret promises made by Roosevelt to Churchill. And regarding Japan, Churchill did not get what he wanted. He wanted Roosevelt to threaten Japan with war if Japan attacked the British Empire in Malaya or in Singapore. Roosevelt said, no, that's not what I want to do. He said he would baby them along in an attempt to buy time. So the phrase he used was baby them along in an attempt to buy at least 30 days, maybe more. And so by the time we got to November, Roosevelt was babying them along, stalling them with negotiations, hoping to gain at least 3 more months of delay until November 26th. This is the lens or filter that I think you need to be looking through if you're an historian to understand Roosevelt's actions against Japan in November, and it's because the 3 naval incidents in the Atlantic that he hoped for occurred, and the American people didn't care. And he gave major speeches. The first was the USS Greer, attacked but not struck by the torpedoes, so there was no damage done. That was on September 4th. He made a big speech September 11th. Nobody cared. The next incident was October 16th. USS Kearney was struck by a torpedo, and many people were killed. The ship barely made it back to port in Iceland. He made a big speech on Navy Day on October 27th. Nobody cared. In fact, the isolationists were up in arms, calling the president a warmonger. So the third incident was on October 31st, and that American destroyer was sunk. USS Kearney was sunk with massive loss of life. And guess what? Roosevelt didn't even talk about it. Wow. He didn't make another speech. He didn't issue an official statement. He didn't say squat because he knew that wasn't going to work. So it's about this time, I would say, from the end of October through November, that Roosevelt's probably thinking about the backdoor war. So the backdoor war. I mentioned the oil embargo, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened to stimulate the oil embargo was 2 things. The first thing, the immediate stimulus was that the Japanese, who had taken over, well, let me rephrase that. The Japanese had pressured Vichy France. Now, this is the lump part of France that the Nazis did not occupy after they defeated France in 1940. They had a puppet government in Vichy France doing what they wanted. And that puppet government in Vichy France controlled French colonies overseas in Southeast Asia. And the Japanese pressured the Vichy government to let them build air bases in North Vietnam and station some troops there. So the Vichy French caved in. That's an obvious sign that the Japanese are expanding into Southeast Asia. So the next year, in July, And we knew this was coming from all the broken diplomatic messages, from all the messages broken by the Purple Machine, which we were reading, which we called the intelligence magic. All the magic intercepts revealed to us the Japanese are about to occupy southern French Indochina, which today we would call South Vietnam and Cambodia. And when they did that in July, on the 24th, I believe, 1941, Roosevelt imposed his total trade embargo on July 26th. He didn't call it an oil embargo, but that's what it was. It was a total freeze of all Japanese assets. It quickly became apparent to the Japanese that it was a de facto oil embargo, although they weren't calling it that, and that 90% of their oil was suddenly cut off. Although that's the proximate cause for that, I'll tell you the strategy behind it. Hitler turned on his one-time temporary ally, the Soviet Union. Remember, he cut a dirty deal with Stalin in August 1939. It called the non-aggression pact with his biggest enemy, the Soviet Union. And the dirty deal they made was that you let me attack Poland and don't go to war to defend Poland, and I'll give you the eastern half of Poland. So that's the dirty deal they made, and that's what happened in 1939. Hitler turns on his temporary ally, Stalin, who's really his life enemy, is the communists, and attacks the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. It's the first big mistake he's made in the war, and boy, it was a humdinger. As soon as that happened, Roosevelt's primary war goal changed. So let me back up a little. In 1940, when Germany attacked Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, and quickly overran all three countries and stood astride Europe, and by the way, kicked the British Army off the continent, Roosevelt's goal became twofold. I'm going to rearm the United States as fast as I can, which he started doing in May 1940, and Congress was more than happy to comply. They multiplied the defense budget that year by a factor of five times bigger than it had been, immediately in May 1940. His second goal, so that was to get America prepared. His second goal was to keep Britain from going under by providing all material aid we could to Great Britain. And then once Germany attacked the Soviet Union, it was clear immediately that that's where most of the war was going to be decided. There were so many soldiers fighting. There were 3.3 million German soldiers, something like that, fighting over 4 million Soviet soldiers, and it's obvious that that's where the war was going to be decided for the most part. That's where all the bloodletting was going on. So his primary goal became no longer to save Britain, it was also to keep the Soviet Union from going under. The last thing Roosevelt wanted to see was the Soviet Union to make a separate peace deal with Hitler, which is what Russia had done in World War I. Russia made a separate peace with the Kaiser's Germany and quit fighting. So he did not want that to happen. So Roosevelt knew from the magic decrypts that the Japanese had a big debate going on all spring and summer of 1941. And the debate within Japan was, are we going to go north and attack our traditional enemy, Russia? Or are we going to go south and grab the resources of Southeast Asia, including the oil of the Dutch East Indies? And they were undecided. And the problem is, they almost had a consensus to go south until Germany attacked Russia. Once Germany attacked Russia and severely weakened Stalin, the Japanese were tempted to go north. And we knew that from their message traffic, their diplomatic message traffic to their embassies. So I'm convinced that this historian Waldo Heinrichs, who wrote a great book about this in 1988 called Threshold to War, he's convinced that the oil embargo, the main purpose, it wasn't just to deter or antagonize Japan. It was to keep Japan from attacking the Soviet Union, because once we cut off Japan's oil in July, once we cut off their oil, they had no choice but to abandon any thoughts of attacking Russia, and instead they had to go south and grab the Dutch East Indies for their oil. And by doing so, they would not be able to attack Siberia and knock Stalin out of World War II. And in fact, this is exactly what happened. Once Stalin figured out in October, through his own spies, that Japan was not going to attack Siberia, he pulled 1.5 million troops out of of Siberia and moved them around Moscow, and that's why Moscow didn't fall to the Nazis. So anyway, this grand strategy of Roosevelt to cut off the Japanese oil and force them to go south instead of north and thereby keep Russia in the war worked. And the stimulus, the public stimulus, and the excuse for doing it was the Japanese moving into southern French Indochina. So anyway, this is a big step he takes in July, which is a provocation. It's a clear provocation of Japan. And which leads me into our next topic. Roosevelt began to become enamored of provocations against Japan the previous fall. So let's go back in time a bit. In May 1940, Germany attacks Western Europe and rolls over everybody. That's when Roosevelt decides, okay, the U.S. fleet's on maneuvers. We're not going to bring it back to the West Coast. We're going to leave it in Pearl Harbor indefinitely. And the Navy doesn't like it. The admiral in charge of the Navy, Richardson, doesn't like it at all. He says the fleet is exposed. There's not enough training facilities out here. There's not enough repair facilities, and the fleet is exposed and could be attacked. I'm not in favor of this. Roosevelt says, do it anyway. So in May of 1940, Roosevelt is interested in deterrence, just deterring Japan from making further moves by moving our fleet to the middle of the Pacific. But in October, I think his focus began to shift from deterrence to provocation. And the big stimulus for that was a memorandum written to him by an officer in naval intelligence. So this gentleman's name was Commander Arthur McCollum, and he doesn't sound very high in the chain of command, but in terms of his influence, he had a lot of influence. He was their Far East expert at ONI in Washington, Office of Naval Intelligence. And one day before Admiral Richardson from Pearl Harbor came to visit Roosevelt in October, McCollum wrote a memo about what to do about Japan. And he proposed 8 courses of action which would put Japan in a box and apply pressure to them. And the final 3 steps were keep the main strength of the U.S. fleet in the Hawaiian Islands, which Roosevelt did, insist that the Dutch refuse to grant Japanese demands for oil, which we did. We insisted the Dutch refuse, and they cooperated. And to completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo by the British Empire. That's what we did in July 41, which I just have been talking about. So those major items in his shopping list of things to pressure Japan were carried out by Roosevelt. But I want to read you the 2 key sentences in his memo. Now, this is on October 7th, 1940. And one key sentence, McCollum says, quote, "It is not believed that in the present state of political opinion, the United States government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado." In other words, gee, it would be nice if we could declare war against Japan, but we need more ado. At the end of the memo, he says, if by these means, and he means his 8-step program, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better, end quote. Can you believe somebody put something like this in writing? But he did. Now, he sent it to his boss, the Chief of Naval Intelligence, and the thing is, it didn't have Roosevelt's name on it, but Roosevelt's actions and the language used in war warnings that were sent the following year mimic the language in this memo. So the language in the war warnings from 1941 in November state, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. Well, let's right out of this guy's memo where he says, if by these means Japan can be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. And of course, the 3 main points in his memo were followed. Now, the interesting thing is, the very day after he wrote this memo, and by the way, Roosevelt was a hands-on navalist, so he would meet with naval officers every afternoon, almost every day. After his official callers would leave the White House, he would meet with his 3 or 4 key naval officers late in the afternoon, and then he would have his cocktail hour after that, where he would only talk about gossip. But before that, he'd have the naval officers come over and visit. So I think that he saw this message before Admiral Richardson visited him the next day, because on the very next day, and I'm looking for my slide here, where is it? On the very next day, Admiral Richardson meets with Roosevelt again, and he says, you know, Mr. President, I still don't think the fleet should be in Pearl Harbor. It's not fooling Japan. It's not having any effect. And the president, and this is from Richardson's memoirs, which were published in in the 1960s. He waited quite a bit of time to publish them. And Roosevelt tells him, quote, "Despite what you believe, I know that the presence of the fleet in the Hawaiian area has had and is now having a restraining influence on the actions of Japan." And Richardson says in his memoirs, he said, quote, "Mr. President, I still do not believe it, and I know that our fleet is disadvantageously disposed for preparing for or initiating war." So there are loggerheads over this. And then Roosevelt tells him during the meeting, this is from Richardson's memoirs, he says, "I asked the president if we were going to enter the war." And here is Roosevelt's reply from his memoirs. He replied that if the Japanese attacked Thailand or the Kra Peninsula, that's Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies, we would not enter the war. That even if they attacked the Philippines, he doubted whether we would enter the war, but that they could not always avoid making mistakes. And as the war continued, and as the area of operations expanded, and here's the punchline, sooner or later they would make a mistake and we would enter the war. That's Roosevelt to the Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. At which point, Richardson made the mistake of saying, "Mr. President, I feel that I must tell you that the senior officers of the Navy do not have the trust and confidence in the civilian leadership of this country that is essential for the successful prosecution of the war in the Pacific, for which he was fired a couple of months later." So let me tell you something else. As Roosevelt, in his mind, is slowly moving from deterrence to provocation. In February of 1941, Roosevelt orders the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, to conduct pop-up cruises in or near Japanese territorial waters in an apparent attempt to provoke an incident with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, does that sound familiar? I've just told you about the Argentia conference off of Canada with Churchill, where Roosevelt wanted to provoke incidents with German U-boats as a way to get into the war against Hitler. Yeah. So here he is, February of 41, saying, "I want pop-up cruises." And listen to what Roosevelt said. Now, this is from Admiral Stark's biography, and he would put all these things in letters to friends, and for which a lot of people damned him later for being so honest. But he would record all these conversations in letters. He would send people letters, so they were all recorded for history. So Roosevelt said to Stark in February 41, quote, "I just want them to keep popping up here and there to keep the Japs guessing. I don't mind losing one or two cruisers, but do not take a chance on losing 5 or 6, end quote. Incredible. So this is a president who was looking for an incident to provoke war with Japan, and if he was lucky, and didn't mind losing 1 or 2 ships, but didn't want to lose 5 or 6. So I think if you connect the Argentia conference, those incidents against the German Navy that he wanted to provoke, and which he did provoke with convoying, with this desire to do pop-up cruises against Japan. And by the way, the most provocative one was on July 31st, 1941, when 2 U.S. heavy cruisers in the dark of night without running lights on tried to enter the Bungo Strait, which is like the entrance to Japan's inland sea between Shikoku Island and Kyushu, which is very heavily patrolled, and the Japanese Navy challenged them. They turned around, laid a smoke screen, and got the heck out of town without identifying themselves. And the Japanese filed a major diplomatic protest. So that was the most provocative of the 3 incidents. It's pretty serious. This is Roosevelt, you see, gradually moving from deterrence, which is moving the Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, to provocation, which is the pop-up cruises, and then, of course, the oil embargo is the big provocation on July 26th. And now, certainly, I want people to understand why Roosevelt's preoccupation was with Germany and not with Japan until the last minute, when that was all he had left. Germany, of course, had the most, efficient military on the planet, and was using blitzkrieg warfare, combining tactical Air Force bombardments with rapid movement of motorized vehicles and cutting to pieces and overwhelming enemy armies. And nobody had seen this before or knew how to combat it. And so the German army appeared invincible. And so Roosevelt, I think, by May of 1940, certainly felt that America had to get in the war. He knew he had a country with a very large isolationist movement, about 35% of the people. and a lot of the newspapers behind them, and a very wary Congress. So he spent a long time trying to educate the public with speeches, and was only partially successful. All he could get the public to do was to support material aid to Britain and later Russia, but not to want to enter the war. But I'm going to tell you why I think Roosevelt wasn't unduly concerned about Japan, not even on November 26th. Some recent statistics have been published about World War II, and as it turns out, during World War II, the United States, listen to this, produced 41.7% of the industrial output of the entire planet during World War II. This one country of ours produced almost 42% of the industrial output. Germany, 14.4%. The USSR, 14%. Great Britain, 10.2%. Japan, only 3.5%. 3.5% to our industrial potential, which was actually used, of 41.7%. Now, these people had a sense of this at the time. These are the final statistics for, produced after the war, but they had a very good sense in this country that this was the case. So the whole attitude of his administration, even after the war began on December 7th, was, it won't do us any good to defeat Japan first if Germany is still intact in fighting us. And so the whole plan was to fight a defensive against Japan until Germany was defeated, Germany first, and that Germany would get, the war with Germany would get 85% of our resources, and the war with Japan would only get 15%, until such time as Germany was defeated, and then we would turn full scale on Japan and finish business. So this decision actually was decided very early in the game, before we even got in the war. The American and British planners met in Washington for 2 months, January to March 1941, called the ABC Conference, and that's when they made the Germany first decision, and were planning, side by side alongside each other, as if they were going to fight the World War together, and that most of our resources would go against Germany. So that's why I think a president who, first of all, didn't think the Japanese could launch torpedoes in shallow Pearl Harbor, who didn't think any Japanese bombs could penetrate the decks of American battleships, and who knew that Japan only had about 3.5% of the world's industrial output, and that we had about 40%. That's why he wasn't unduly concerned about Japan and was willing to let the blow fall. Certainly no one expected, I'm sure Roosevelt didn't, that the damage of Pearl Harbor would be so extensive. Now, what's behind all this skullduggery, and what do I have to say about Roosevelt's core values and his personality? I got a lot to say. Roosevelt was someone who worried about ends and not means. That was the key to his personality. His personality was one of bewildering complexity. He was always performing. He once told actor Orson Welles, the great radio actor and filmmaker, that they were the two greatest actors in America. And, he included himself in that group of two. Harry Truman, after FDR's death, said he was the coldest man I ever met. And, in fact, so did his own Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, say that about him. Walter Lippmann, one of the main columnists in the United States, once said Roosevelt was a wonderful finagler. He loved to take a complicated thing which involved a certain amount of deception, hornswaggling of people, and somehow get it done. That's a heck of a quote. Here's a better one. This is by historian John Meacham, who wrote a book called Franklin and Winston about 10 years ago about Churchill and Roosevelt and their correspondence. And he wrote, "What could make Roosevelt a trying husband and a frustrating friend could make him a great president. Sometimes politicians have to pursue different courses at the same time and deceive those closest to them about what they are doing," end quote. So Roosevelt, he was a champion of the common man. He was a strong advocate of human rights and individual freedoms. And by the way, he strongly supported free trade and self-determination for all peoples. He despised the British Empire and colonialism and mercantilism. So, he basically forced the British to sign the Atlantic Charter in August. And they had to eat it. They hated that document because it basically spelled the end of their empire after the war. He forced them to sign it because he basically, for 2 days he argued with Churchill. What we're not going to go to war to save the British Empire. The American people won't support that, neither will I. We'll go to war to defeat Hitler, but not to save your empire. So he forced them to sign that document. Roosevelt was a Wilsonian internationalist. He believed in the interdependency of modern nations and in avoiding war through engagement with other leaders, not through isolationism. And, of course, he strongly opposed fascism. So to sum up here, FDR had a multifaceted personality and was a man of many faces. So in the pursuit of his ends, his altruistic core values, FDR could employ means that were devious and duplicitous, elusive and dissembling, and manipulative. In other words, in pursuit of noble ends, he could employ means that were Machiavellian. So that's the story on the FDR that I know. There's something I haven't mentioned yet. What I'd like to do is I'd like to end up reading some of the testimony of George Marshall and Henry Stimson before Congress about that, which implies they knew about the Pearl Harbor attack. They didn't come right out and say it, but it strongly implies it, and why they didn't want to give a warning. But before I get to that, you don't even have to believe in code breaking to believe that Roosevelt knew the attack was coming, because the Dutch naval attaché to the United States, Captain Johan Roneft, made 2 diary entries, one on December 2nd, 1941, and one on December 6th, 1941, in which he recorded that he went to the O&I offices in Washington, Office of Naval Intelligence, and they were plotting the progress of a Japanese task force across the North Pacific, going east, from Japan going east. And in fact, I'm going to read you the 2 diary entries, and I'm going to tell you how O&I got that information. On December 2nd, his diary entry is very short. He says, meeting at the Navy Department, the location of 2 Japanese carriers leaving Japan with an eastern course are pointed out to me on the map. So that's all that diary entry said. But the one on the 6th is the one that's the most revealing. So this is the day before Pearl Harbor, and he writes, at 2 o'clock a.m. to the Navy Department, the department is closed except the division O&I, where a night watch is kept. Everyone is present, and then he lists some names. This Commander McCollum, the head of O&I, Admiral Wilkinson, other people, and he says, at my request, they show me the location of the 2 carriers west of Honolulu. I ask, what is the meaning of these carriers at this location? Whereupon I receive the answer that it is probably in connection with intentional Japanese moves, after a war begins. No one among us mentions the possibility of an attack on Honolulu. I myself do not think about it because I believe everyone at Honolulu is 100% on the alert, just like everyone here at the Office of Naval Intelligence, end quote. So he published his diary in 1952. His translations from Dutch to English have been verified by the Dutch, by The Hague, by the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And I'm going to tell you right now, Ed, if the head of Office of Naval Intelligence knew we were tracking Japanese carriers across the North Pacific, then the president knew. The president met with the chief of naval operations, the head of O&I, the chief of naval war plans, and others who were couriers like Lieutenant Commander Kramer, Commander McCollum, on a routine basis. There's no way the head of O&I would be tracking Japanese movements of that nature and that the president would not know. So to me, this is just corroboration that the president knew beforehand. And but the timing of these doesn't match with the flip-flop on foreign policy. So that's why I believe Roosevelt was sent the contents of that message sent on November 22nd. I believe he received that the morning of the 26th. But this is an additional proof that he had to have foreknowledge. Now, O&I didn't have the whole story. They thought it was only 6 to 8 ships, and they thought it was only 2 Japanese carriers. That's called the fog of war. But the point is the Japanese fleet did not keep radio silence, which is what the mainstream historians told us for many decades. There were people in Alaska at Navy intercept stations, and people in Washington State, and people on the coast of California, radio intercept stations and radio direction finding equipment who noticed Japanese radio signals for about a 5-day period, from about November 30th through December 4th. And they concluded that Akagi, which was the name of the Japanese flagship, was talking to other ships at a low power on a certain frequency. This is the frequency Akagi had been using that month, earlier that month in November. So the frequency was spot on, and as it turns out, as the Japanese fleet was moving across the North Pacific, these ships are being loosely followed by 7 oil tankers. And they had to refuel at sea just to get to Hawaii and to get home. And there was a major North Pacific storm, and apparently the oil tankers probably got scattered. That's the hypothesis, I believe. Got scattered by the storm more than once. And they were rounding these guys up so they could refuel at sea. And they were using low power settings of frequencies that normally weren't used. And the trouble is, right then, we had a massive sunspot activity, and low power transmissions that normally would not have gone more than 100 miles were going halfway around the planet. So this has all been put together by Robert Stinnett in his book Day of Deceit, and by John Toland in his book Infamy. And so that is how these people that remember intercepting this information and sending the information from San Francisco to Washington, to ONI, this is how they would be able to plot the position of some Japanese ships on a nautical chart. And this is how the Dutch naval attaché would be able to record this in his diary. So it all kind of fits together for me. And I mentioned at the beginning, I think we have time.
We have 5 minutes left. 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read excerpts from 3 people. One is Harry Hopkins. Now, Harry Hopkins was the Secretary of Commerce for FDR. He was unofficially the deputy president. He even lived in the White House starting in 1941. And he wrote a diary entry the day of Pearl Harbor before he went to bed that night. And he wrote about the meeting of the admirals and generals after the attack took place. And he said, quote, "The conference met in not too tense an atmosphere because I think that all of us believe that in the last analysis, the enemy was Hitler and that he could never be defeated without force of arms. That sooner or later we were bound to be in the war and that Japan had given us an opportunity." That's a heck of a quote. And then he wrote a memo for the record in January of 42, just a short time later, and in 3 or 4 different ways in the memo says that the president was always concerned that Secretary of State Hull did not understand that if the Japanese only attacked Singapore and only attacked the Dutch East Indies, that we would have a problem going to war because the Congress wouldn't authorize it. In fact, Hopkins writes, because the declaration of war is up to Congress and the isolationists, indeed a great part of the American people, would not be interested in a war in the Far East merely because Japan attacked the Dutch or the British. I recall the president talking about this many times in the past year, and it always disturbed him because he really thought that the strategy the Japanese would use would be to avoid conflict with us, that they would not attack either the Philippines or Hawaii, but would move on Thailand, French Indochina, etc. Hence his great relief at the method that Japan used. In spite of the disaster at Pearl Harbor and the blitz warfare with the Japanese in the first few weeks, it completely solidified the American people. This is Harry Hopkins telling the truth at the time, not 30 or 40 years later. So Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, is the one who made the diary entry on November 25th, where he's quoting the president at a cabinet meeting saying, this is the day before Roosevelt flipped his policy, saying, the question was how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. So Congress was up in arms about this diary entry because Stimson had just published his diary in 1945. And everybody was really agitated about what does this mean? And so he was asked to answer questions under oath. And one of the answers is where he says, we should not be placed in the position of firing the first shot if this could be done without sacrificing our safety. But that Japan should appear in their true role as the aggressor.
Doug, my clock is off. We're at the end of the show. Do you have any appearances coming up?
I'm going to be on Black Op Radio sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks. I'm not sure when.
Doug, thank you so much. Okay, the book is Deception, Intrigue, and
The Road to War.
The Road to War. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thanks, Ed.
My clock must be off because normally we go to a 6:55, and I got 6:53 here. Oh boy! Anyway, I thought that was really incredible information. I wanted to ask him some more questions, but he was on such a roll. I was wondering how this work, which is really incredibly well researched, is being received out there with these World War II historians, which are such a finicky group. The book is Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. Incredible stuff. I guess maybe I'll call in to, I think he's going to be on Doug Campbell's show coming up soon. Maybe I can call in there and ask him that question. But I think this is really fascinating material and something that I'm so weak in history. And these kind of things, so it was just the way he presented the information was a real blessing to me. That I didn't have to ask too many questions. Just presented the way he presented was excellent. I apologize for screwing up timing there. This clock must be off. Well, coming up after this, we got William Ramsey, and he's got this guy Jason Horsley. And I think it's a show called Horticulture, something like that. I'm not sure exactly what it is. And then after that, we have Doug Campbell coming on with the Dallas Action. He has a new show tonight, too, as well. What am I doing? Next week, I think we have another West Memphis 3 show, believe it or not, with that other book, the King of the Freaks, something like that. I got to do a little background on that. We're going to fill 2 hours with it. Let's see what else is going on. I don't know. The book is Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. So check that out on Amazon. Don't forget the member section. That's what keeps us going here. We have no YouTube income left. Okay, the YouTube income is not even 50% of what it was 2 months ago. And you have no idea how much work that is to... As a matter of fact, while I was doing the show here, we got an email from YouTube that the show we did with Dr. Michelle Stevens and Amy Villela is not advertiser friendly, so they demonetized it. So that's while we were doing the show. Give you an idea how much work it is to maintain a YouTube channel with this nonsense. Basically now, it looks like this month I'm going to be making like $150 for the month. And by the way, I already count on that money, man, too, by the way. So we're going to be... I guess we'll do away with YouTube, and if you want those shows, you got to become a member. We'll put them in the member section. I guess. I don't know what to do, Still be on Spreaker for a while, but the Spreaker prices are going up, too, as well. That's like right now, I think it's either $50 a month or $100 a month I pay for Spreaker to keep that going. So, no fun. Bills. The member section is at OppermanReport.com. There's a lot of great new content in there. By the way, this is Doug Horne is a big guest. This is the guy behind Operation Northwoods. He found those documents. This guy hasn't done an interview in like 5-7 years, something like that. Close to 10 years. So this was a big guest and great content. Thank you so much, Douglas Horne. Do you want to support the show? OppermanReport.com. Become a member. That's the way to do it. Or you can send a donation. Always take donations, OppermanReport@gmail.com. It's always nice to see even $5 in there. You wake up, You wake up. Check your email. 25 people complaining because I took a sip of water during the show. And, a $5 donation. He says, oh, it's all worth it. It's all worth it. You climb down off the ledge. You're about to jump off. Because someone sent you $5. That's what life is like around here these days. Oh, boy. Okay, coming up next, William Ramsey. Hasta la vista.